This is Sarah Jones on the Politicus Pod for Politicus USA's The Daily. Make sure you subscribe to The Daily Politicus so you don't miss any episodes. Today, we're going to be talking about the threat the media poses to our democracy and how the media has become, perhaps unintentionally, complicit in this growing threat of autocracy. The media has been pushing false equivalencies and asymmetric coverage of, for example, the age of the two leading presidential candidates, President Joe Biden, the Democrat, and former President Donald Trump, the Republican, the latter of whom has been criminally indicted on 91 counts and recently found liable for sexual assault and in a separate case for fraud. Trump is also accused of inciting a terrorist attack against the United States in an attempted self coup to remain in power, even after the people voted him out. In other words, it's very clear that these two candidates are not the same. And even after it's become clear that Donald Trump and the Republican Party under his leadership are harmful to the national security of the United States, and indeed the very concept of the US and her sacred freedoms, the media's will and capability to tackle encroaching autocracy remains distressing, whether that's due to a corporate mindset, the for-profit news, clickbait, or an outdated method of journalism, which is so easily exploited by dishonest actors such as the he said, she said version of journalism. But, the bottom line is the media should be fair to the public and to the facts. There is no obligation to present both parties as the same. Yet, even as the Republican Party over the last decade has become more corrupt, the media continues to launder their misinformation and phony scandals. And sure, Democrats have been guilty of this as well, but just on a scale, this is largely benefiting the Republican Party. Joining me today to discuss this is Kaivan Shroff, a Democratic political commentator and public interest attorney. He is a frequent guest on CNN Tonight and a press secretary for Dream America. Welcome to the Politicus Pod, Kaivan.
Great to join, Sarah. I know we've been following each other for a few years, so glad to be on.
It's so good to have you, and I really can't wait to get into this. So, you are an expert on this, and you've brought up a lot of thoughts about this. One of your concepts that you've mentioned many times is that I want you to get into here for our audience is the trifecta of bad incentives. The book deals, the cable news hits, and going viral. So, how do you see that has degraded the fourth estate? And do you think it's gotten worse since 2016, or is it the same?
Yes, so, I really focused on this for a project, a capstone at Harvard Law School and the Kennedy School, where I was really focused on we had to pick a big public problem. And I thought one of the most timely public problems we face as a country and a democracy is clearly the decline of trust in our media. And also, I think the degradation of journalism. It's not just perception, of course. So one of the things I tapped into was what I'm calling the trifecta of bad incentives. And this is something I think we saw very clearly during the Trump era, but even started earlier. And what those incentives are, and you mentioned some of them, social media fame, going viral, I think blurring the lines we've seen between influencers and journalists and why that costs us trust at an accelerated rate. Then number two, all these book deals that it seems like reporters are more focused on than actually reporting. And even we've seen so many cases now where reporters are sitting on scoops of national importance so that they can save that for a book launch or a book tour, a year plus later. What does that cost the public? And then third, the cable news hits and wanting to be on TV and wanting to go viral again in those sort of reality TV-esque exchanges, making themselves the story. And I think, some of those moments were really positive. I think a lot of us fondly remember Jim Acosta standing up to bullies at the White House, press secretary room, briefing room, and, going toe to toe with Sarah Sanders and Trump, who were lying to the public. But now that we do have trustworthy folks in those roles, you still see some of the same behaviors where these reporters want to have that moment and it's not necessarily in service of the truth. It's more in service of their agenda. So would love to get into all of that.
That is, you have raised so many good points. And just going to that Jim Acosta moment, there's a great example. He to me is someone who is has been doing, and continues to do a good job. And it seemed like he was always behaving in that confrontation. For example, they were lying about him, and he was standing up for the right for the press to ask these questions that he was trying to ask. Um, then I do see people trying to model themselves off of that to have this moment where they're kind of shrieking at the press secretary, um, in hopes of getting attention for really questions. A lot of times they're not even based in reality, which I'm sad to say that, because I do support. I want to just put that out there. There's such a difference in the when we're talking about individual journalists. I think most of them have good intentions. So that's part of the question too. How do we get here where people are putting this, as you put it, like this viral fame moment ahead of their own integrity? The book deals, what a great point, because over and over again, these little nuggets of, oh, yeah, your country was at risk and I held it for my book. Here we are 2 years later. You know, that does not inspire trust in people. And one of my concerns about the lack of trust in media is how many people have tuned out to politics altogether because of this media coverage.
Absolutely. And I think, the reason I frame it as a trifecta is because they really are all related incentives. And when you look at it, right, it's say that you want to get a book deal. Well, the publisher cares that you have followers. So these journalists are then incentivized to build a following online. Now, why do they have followers in the first place? Why does Maggie Haberman have, about 2 million followers? It's not because her tweets are so genius. It's because of her role as a reporter for the New York Times. And so for her to then intersperse her own opinions, right, with that incentive of going viral that don't actually pass an editor, like her actual reporting for the Times, which is what people are following her for, would go through, that's a problem. And then, of course, you tie it to saving the scoops, because to sell the book, to get on cable, you have to have the scoop. They don't want to have you on cable 2 years later to talk about what you wrote about, in history. They want you to say, we have an exclusive, come on the show, talk about it. And that'll sell books, and that'll drive the coverage and the tour and all that stuff. So it really does all work together. But what it does is it really accelerates distrust, because we, the public, are watching this in real time. We're seeing, every other day, Jake Tapper's pushing his book in his Twitter feed. Like, are we being sold a product, or are we being told the news? And I think, of course, it's fair to say that this is a complex, nuanced situation, and media is, constantly changing. So I'm not saying no journalist should ever hawk their book online, but you see a blurring of the lines from a time past.
There is such a blurring, and you just hit on something, and I've never spoken about this publicly, and I'm not going to name names, but I do want to go back to something you just said, because I don't think people are really aware of this. There is that blurring between journalists and social media, star kind of thing. And one of the things that several journalists have done that I've been on the receiving end of is they will send me daily their tweet that they want promoted, right? They never offer to reciprocate. There isn't like oh, I like your work, which I've had plenty of people. Yeah. And if I like what they're doing, and I think it's important, I have no problem sharing that. But I don't like having this kind of spam filling up my inbox every day from the same people, and then watching those people, because they get other people to do this for them, watching them end up on cable news when I know that
Mm-hmm.
they got there through this kind of really dishonest presentation of their own popularity. And I think that judging people by their popularity, that's not a good way to go. It's not about that. You could have 10 followers on Twitter and be somebody whose brain is really worth listening to. In fact, probably that's probably more likely. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's
Right.
more likely that if you're, because it's really hard to present complex ideas and nuanced ideas on Twitter. You don't see Rachel Maddow hanging out on Twitter because you can't get into policy on Twitter, really. I mean, you know, what do you, so okay, so what do you think about, um, let me just ask you a few questions about different examples of things that have happened in the media and how, what you think is making that complicit. One of the things um, that I'm very concerned with is the way that it seems like people who want to exploit the holes in our media, and mostly those people right now are, I would say, knowingly or unknowingly acting in service of foreign powers that are hostile to the United States. Um, and so that's troubling, right? You'd expect that to be checked by these people. So here's an
Hmm.
example. How did January 6th get whitewashed by right? It's hardly ever brought up anymore in the media. And it was a huge, we've never, this was historic and it hasn't been dealt with successfully, really. I mean, people are being prosecuted, but those are all the low-level people. We haven't seen the people, many of them are in Congress, who
Hmm.
helped Donald Trump carry that out. How do you think that's being, what's behind that sort of, let's not talk about, is it just because it's not
Well,
exciting anymore?
I think it's funny, right? Like on the one hand, I think press will argue it's not exciting, people aren't interested, but are people interested to continue to talk about Joe Biden's age for 6 years? Like that doesn't make sense. So it's not the interest piece. I do think that if you mapped out all the issues and all the news stories, somehow the reasonable, moderate issues that people care about, right? Like I think every reasonable pro-democracy person should care a whole lot about January 6th. Those stories don't get the same attention as the crazy, moms for liberty issues that they focus on and obsess about, or some, outrageous thing that Cori Bush might have said that went viral. These are the stories that get elevated and amplified. And particularly, I do think there is a right-wing ecosystem, a blogosphere of, I don't know if you've ever been targeted by it. I certainly have,
I
where,
have.
they pick on you and there's one story and all of a sudden within a day or 2 days, there's going to be 10 stories about you. And these are sort of right-wing outlets, but they kind of have an in with the mainstream media. So then suddenly mainstream media picks it up. And, Caitlin Collins, what's her background, right? She got her start at the Daily Caller. So
Hmm.
a lot of these folks have been in and out of these spaces. Why is the New York Times hiring all these right-wing operatives? I mean, it's pretty blatant. And so whose worldview are those folks reporting on and seeing? So I do think there's a double standard there. And, even just talking about, right, your DM that you mentioned, because I get some of
Hmm.
those and I'm also conflicted. I don't mind it when it's like I had a really viral tweet on a topic and that person just wrote a story about it. So they're like, hey, did you see it? I'm fine with that. What I don't like to
Yeah.
see is like a journalist who clearly has pegged me as, this is a pro Biden person. I'm going to send in my pro Biden stories to amplify. And I'm sure they're never sending me their, pro Trump stories. But it's because what it does is it reflects this incentive and really a conflict of interest. Now, say that I do take on a role, right? I have a role in a nonprofit. I had a role in a few places. Now, if they covered that, is there a conflict of interest because I'm boosting them? Or if I don't boost them, am I going to be held accountable for that, right? It's sort of all of these lines that don't need to be crossed, really,
Hmm.
And I think one of the things that stuck with me in my research is the New York Times in 2014 or around then focused on this report called the Innovation Report. And what they found from that report, and it's kind of interesting to look at the BuzzFeeds and the HuffPosts today because those were sort of the leaders at that time. And the New York Times reflected that when the New York Times journalist would hit publish, that was the end of their story. When the BuzzFeed or Huffington Post journalist would hit publish, that was the beginning of the life cycle of their story. Then it was on that journalist or that media outlet to go hawk that article everywhere for clicks and engagement and virality. And suddenly the New York Times decided it would be a great idea to copy that model. And I think that was a huge mistake where basically they are enlisting their reporters to also be on the business end of getting the engagement and getting people to see the story.
Wow. Yes, that makes complete sense. And I also share your, when I get these messages, I'm thinking, I don't know, um, I just don't, I try to be so careful about what I share, that things have integrity, that the people I'm sharing have integrity. You know,
Right.
it gets and I feel, and I sometimes especially after Elon has taken over, and it's very difficult now to kind of sift through people who I don't want to be any part of amplifying falsehoods or extremism. And I think that's something else that you're touching on is that the media sees extremism, which is drama, that's their story instead of the story
Mhm.
for all of the people in the middle, which is the majority of the country. And how can we inform them? And how can they know what's going on in their government? Why are they only being told about Joe Biden's age, which I'm pretty sure everyone knows about? They knew about it the last time he ran for president, the time he won. Everybody knew then. Nobody, it's not a big secret that needs to be
Right.
constantly discussed. And I think also if that's going to be discussed, then it should only be discussed in the context of has his age caused him to
Mhm.
make a mistake, right? Is his government floundering? Is he not leading this government? But in
Well,
fact, I cover him. I cover this Biden White House constantly, and they're doing. I have been amazed at the progress that they are making, and so in that way, it's like that's clearly not true. He's clearly leading his government, he's leading his administration to do really important things for people's daily lives that our media doesn't seem to think is exciting enough to even talk about.
well, I think, there's all these incentives that are bad, but I think also when you zoom out, and I have great respect for anyone who wants to do the public service and the great journalism that we all have, I think, in mind, and we were taught about in schools, the importance of the fourth estate. But you zoom out and you look at who really is making up the media these days. What do they know? Like, what have they done? What are they educated in? What is their background? Like, I think just any reporter, if you just start with that question and you go look and say, okay, but at the end of the day, who is Ezra Klein? He's a
Mhm.
blogger who really was able to compete with a business model at a time and got absorbed by mainstream media. Nate Silver, same thing. Who is Nate Silver to be commenting on every single development in the world with such confidence? I mean, he got a few predictions right, and again, was absorbed by mainstream media,
Mhm.
became a huge voice. But go look at what's Maggie Haberman's background. She was a real estate reporter who won the lottery because the guy she happened to cover as a real estate reporter ended up becoming the president of the United States. That doesn't mean she suddenly has a great understanding of sociology and race and, politics or any of that, right? So, I mean,
Ugh,
it's not to degrade in any way. It's just to say
no,
these people are gatekeepers to
right.
such important information and power, and yet they never get vetted at the level, right? Think of a doctor, think of a lawyer, even, police officers. We think of these as like sort of civic adjacent roles, right? They play an important position in our democracy to some extent, public officials, all these folks. Why is it that you have to go to med school for so long and get all these requirements, right? In the legal environment, you're getting, exposed to a certain baseline of civil procedure and things you understand. Even in business school, you get like an ethics class. No journalist, you couldn't guarantee that every journalist has taken sociology. You couldn't guarantee that every journalist has taken an ethics class because there's no requirement to go be a journalist. Down to, right? You could get your start at the New York Daily News writing, tabloid trash, and suddenly in a decade, you're the head of politics at the New York Times. So
That's
it's a
yes.
very alarming industry that really has, you don't want to over credential and exclude people from accessing an industry so important. At the same time, you have to have some baseline requirements.
Right. And everything you're saying is wow. I think you've just it really sums up, the three people that you mentioned, just by name, all have this sort of contemptuous attitude toward your general reader, towards
Mm-hmm.
towards the public. And I've seen that from reporters at the New York Times more times than I can count. And it's really dismaying to me because that goes to this level of privilege, and probably most of the people covering the news are coming from a position of privilege, at least if they have a loud voice. Now, that's not everybody, but it is way too many. It is the majority of people have
Mm-hmm.
they've never gone without health insurance. They've never had to go month to month to pay their bills, and that is also a framework that is behind the way they're covering the news, and this sort of the way elites kind of ride together. It's ride or die together, and I've been thinking about, and you touched on this a little bit, the media ownership, of course, has gotten smaller and smaller. There's just like six companies basically that are responsible for 90% of what people see. And the media ownership. So they are siding with other elites. And I keep seeing people saying, oh, why are they doing this with Trump? That they're not going to do well under a Trump administration. Don't they know that? Well, actually, the media elites are going to do very well under a Trump administration. They did last time. Those people also all have a way to get out of this country at the last minute if they ever need to. It's the rest of us that are going to be stuck with
Well,
what they've created.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I can tell you for one thing, the book deals have absolutely dried up, and it's something that the White House press corps has actually spoken about, off the record, that all of a sudden the fire hose of book deals under the Trump administration, you don't get that for Biden. There was a big profile book on Joe Biden. It didn't sell too many copies, not that it's not an interesting story about Jill Biden and her history, but somehow, when things are calm and normal, it doesn't sell a lot of books. And I think that's good for the country. It's bad for the White House press corps seeking deals. Now, I will say, I don't know that these reporters themselves are so privileged and rich in some sense. I think they're highly educated and part of a certain cultural class. But I will say, I think almost the opposite effect I notice, where part of what I think makes them so hesitant to cover Biden's incredible economy, which just it's indisputable on the numbers, and economists agree that we have such a strong economy, but it took the press so long, is because look at the journalism industry. It's an industry in free fall. It's an industry in crisis where you have the Messenger going out of business and all of a sudden 300 journalists are out of a job. You have, all these shufflings at cable places. You have, outlet after outlet, even the Wall Street Journal doing mass layoffs. And suddenly, the little bubble that all these reporters live in are in industry that doesn't have a vibrant business model at this moment and is struggling, and they're in free fall and they're clinging to what they know, which is a right-wing older audience on cable. All that stuff is happening. So it doesn't feel like the economy is great, but these reporters can't do their jobs. They can't take themselves out of that situation and say, I know this sucks, but it's still not the truth to say the economy's bad.
And that's a good point. I mean, our media is, I mean, we've gone through it at Politicus USA, and it really started for us under the Trump administration. So it started much earlier for us because he targeted us for a number of things, and um, it became harder and harder. And I think even Facebook and all these other places started really trying to cut out anybody who was in the middle or leaning to the left to cut off their traffic. And then Google News came in and started cutting payouts by like 75% at sometimes. And but when you look at bigger outlets like the New York Times, they just made $1 billion last
Mm-hmm.
year in their subscriptions. So they're not beholden to ad dollars. And they do have like it's sort of no matter what the individual reporter and where their background, what their background is, they're in this environment, and it's like people do strive in an environment, especially they want to stay employed. And you look at this media landscape right now, and people have even more incentive to stay employed. And especially if you're at a big place like that has a lot of prestige, then you want to stay there. You're going to try to fit in even more to that environment. And I think that that's part of this. It's like a trickle down from the top, and the top are the elite people and the way they
Mm-hmm.
see the world. So even when they started trying to, not just the New York Times, but all media outlets started trying to finally hire some diverse people to get different worldviews. But what do? They tell those people they're not allowed to cover that beat. And I always notice, like, you never told white men they couldn't cover all the policies that white men are making or the problems that white men are making. But you tell a woman she can't cover the abortion story, and you tell a Black reporter they can't
Mm-hmm.
cover Black Lives Matter because, somehow they're activists if they cover that. And I think that's a big blind spot. And to me, really reeks of unintentional bias, but bias nonetheless. I mean, if you're going to hire people to get a diverse viewpoint, you have to let them bring that viewpoint to the news.
Right.
That's the entire point, right? Like, so if you're silencing them, so this is another I don't know if you're watching. I started watching this show on Apple TV, The New Look, which kind of talks about and it shows how differently Coco Chanel and Christian Dior handled the Nazis. And I'm only bringing this up because it really I just did a piece last week, I think, on how like the New York Times was normalizing Hitler 9 months after the concentration camps opened. They were still talking about, oh, he's a great host. He loves his dogs. Look at his beautiful chalet. And to that end, I do think that this when you have an authoritarian in the picture, and he's like Donald Trump, that's so you got encroaching authoritarianism on the horizon, pressuring all the institutions in our democracy, which most of which are not holding up so well, I have to say. Um, you will see other elites being incentivized by the authoritarian, like the Supreme Court that we just saw. It can all be based on different things, as you talked about with the trifecta. It can be your career advancement, it can be power, it can be wealth, but an authoritarian knows how to dangle those kind of incentives in front of different people, and certainly Donald Trump knows how to do it for the media. Because as you pointed out, Joe Biden's not selling books. Running the country competently is boring. And it should be, but these people all want to make money, right?
I know,
So
just the example to interject for a second, because I was so outraged by
yeah.
that annoying Jon Stewart
uh,
interview where he's
yeah.
like, well, why don't you show Biden, in the war zones? It's like, sorry that the president and the commander in chief is not focused on having a camera crew follow him in secret to war zones so that he can show it as propaganda. Like, seriously.
I mean, you know what? People got angry at me about this on Twitter, and I'm that whole thing is just what it is. But so go ahead and at me, people. My handle. Um, I have never really liked his both sides coverage, and I was really hoping he wasn't going to bring that back. And I think in a way he's trying to dial that back now, but he did kind of,
Mhm.
that's how he came back with a very strong. And I know it gets laughs and there's people who like that, but you know what? It's not reality. It's not what's happening. And Joe Biden, yes, he did go to Ukraine, but no, we're not going to have Netflix follow him so that everybody, so we
Right.
can do a little documentary, a little doc on the prez, like that's exactly the world. It just kind of it makes me so sad to think that you're not looking around and, as journalists, as the media, you're not seeing the vulnerable people, the immigrants,
Mhm.
the people crossing the border who, if Donald Trump is in office, will be shot probably because Greg Abbott he'll let Greg Abbott do that. Um, it's just and women with their basic human rights being taken away from them in this country. How is that not dramatic? How is that not capturing people's attention to say there's a lot at stake here? Why don't we pull back from these false equivalencies? Today this happened. Okay, today we were treated to presidents, and I this is Biden and Trump both appear at the border
Mhm.
as if Donald Trump didn't order the House Republicans to kill the bipartisan border deal. Like that's not mentioned. It's just that he showed up there. So maybe if you bring the camera crew with you to the border, like the Republicans like to do, you put on a big show and then you get all the coverage. I mean, there is that kind of incentive too, that I don't think Democrats have ever known how to put on a show. They just they really stink at putting on a show, and putting on a show shouldn't be what they should be good at. But with this press, it's kind of what you have to be good at. You
But
know,
I
you,
will say too, I always hear the feedback that Democrats aren't great at messaging, and
mm,
that could be part of it. I certainly think there's things they could improve, but we've seen over and over again when they do kill the messaging, even when they do that exact thing that everyone's been asking for, it just doesn't get covered still. Like, I'll never forget one day, oh, okay, it was the Inflation Reduction Act 1 year anniversary. And Joe Biden was giving a historic speech about the Inflation Reduction Act and how it's been effective. And they finally were starting to report on, oh, wow, imagine good policy, it works. And as this speech is going on, MSNBC cuts away from it. And what do you have? You have Mehdi Hassan and you have Chris Hayes, two of their huge anchors, tweeting, oh, Joe Biden's so bad at messaging. He really needs to run around and tell people that the Inflation Reduction Act has worked. And it's like, he's literally doing it as you're tweeting this, criticizing him for not. And guess what? Your network turned away. So sometimes it's really an impossible puzzle, I think, for Democrats to solve alone.
I think you're so right about that. And I have many times pointed out to people. In fact, I got into this with a New York Times reporter who was like, it's not our job to do PR for
Yes,
Joe
wait, I
Biden.
know exactly who you're talking about. We should talk about
Okay.
it because it's such a good
Yes.
example, right?
Yes.
The
That's a perfect
economics
example.
reporter for the New
Yeah.
York Times
Yes.
tweets out, I just went to a party in Brooklyn with all these 30-year-olds and my friends, and they don't know what the CHIPS Act is, and they don't know what the IRA is. And so the Biden administration has a lot of work to do. This is
Mm.
such important legislation. And then I go look at his bio, and it's like, you literally, your job is to cover economics for the New York Times.
This has
And
killed me.
his
What?
response is,
Yeah.
right, I don't do PR for them, and Biden
Yes.
hasn't sat down with me for a one-on-one interview. It's like, are you crazy? The president has to sit down with you for you to cover huge pieces of legislation that affect the economy and your readers' everyday lives? I mean, insanity. So
And, I'm not an economics reporter, but I cover Joe Biden's economy and legislation and changes that they're doing every day to try to make this a better country. I cover that more than this guy. I mean, I cover it like, I don't know, 4 times a week at least. And I was just stunned that this is his attitude. And I told him, actually, I love to use that with men who are like explaining things to me because they always do the actually. So I always use it back and I say, actually, President Biden has surrogates out all over the country doing public events about these pieces of legislation. If you don't know about it, that's on you. That's why your readers don't know about it. That's why your friends
well,
don't know about it because you don't even know about it.
and
What's he
then
doing?
what I think is compounding, right? So you just talked about this situation, which is a real problem of a journalist who seems bad at their job and to have a poor perspective. But then what is also happening, right? They're taking it online because they think they're so charming and funny. So they want to tell you, I went to a party with my girlfriend, yo, like, I have friends, whatever it is, the point of the tweet, who knows? But then suddenly you got you dunking and me dunking, not dunking you, right? We're legitimately calling something bad out. But then they get back and forth and they're defending themselves and their other reporter friends chime in. And now millions of impressions have happened over this, public Twitter battle about journalists being unprofessional. And it's really not the right forum. But what it does is it further alienates the public, no matter what. Even in those cases where the journalists might be in the right, I don't think this is an example of that. It's not the forum to do it, right? Like to be fighting with readers online, even if to be blocking folks, how many New York Times people block readers who
Mm-hmm.
offer valid criticism? I understand blocking somebody who's being, threatening or rude or harassing, but saying, I think your coverage is unfair, you shouldn't block somebody for that. If you're a reporter for the New York Times, that's a big deal.
I think absolutely. And that's one of the things that I do see from their reporters pretty often. And they've also got this thing where they say when the liberals are oh, it's the liberals saying this and they're attacking me. So then I know I'm doing my job right. And it's like, wow, you never see them say that kind of stuff about conservatives. And I don't think they should be saying about anyone, but I think that they have this idea that liberals are all the elite. But most liberals are not elite. There is a contingency of elite liberals, just like there are elite conservatives. But that's no reason. When you work at the New York Times, you're at the top of the heap. You should never punch down. That is a very bad. I wouldn't let someone do that who works for Politicus USA. I would be horrified if someone talked to our readers that way. Um, it's your responsibility to listen to the feedback. You don't have to listen to people abusing you. Absolutely, draw the line there. But when people are saying, how come, this is just my opinion. Either you don't have to respond at all, or you can respond and try to take it on board. But this whole attitude they have of looking down their noses at readers, I find that very off-putting. And I think it is part of the problem because there is a culture there. Who knows where that guy in particular, I don't know his background. He could have grown up poor for all I know, but his attitude now is certainly one that is helping only the elites in this country. And they're not people who are looking out for democracy. Of course, democracy is something that is meant to help everyone in the country. And if you don't have a democracy, you have just the elites being, the people who are already wealthy. Those people maintain their status quo and they continue to get the good things that they've been getting. And they probably have to pay even less taxes, so it's like people aren't looking at that perspective of why this kind of elitism to me is such a problem right now, especially if you're doing, you're covering the news right now. That attitude should be dropped. I just don't understand why anyone who's in charge would allow that. But I do want to ask you, okay, I got two. Here's another example, just really quick. I want to throw out current news stories. So we did the border. Okay. Um, the the Biden is old, right? So that's taken hold in the news. Then we had the House Republicans who based their Biden impeachment on Russian disinformation. And what is the media doing about that? They're barely even discussing that. What do you think's going on in that situation? Why aren't they talking about really the threat that Russia continues to pose to our democracy and the way they've been trying to undermine our elections over and over again?
Right. I mean, and a story that they've covered again for years and years and years, suddenly the whole thing falls apart in the most humiliating fashion. You couldn't ask for a better sort of grand finale if all you're looking for is entertainment value, which sadly often seems to be the case with the media's coverage. And yet it doesn't serve, the Republican narrative. It's good for Joe Biden, so they just ignore it. They just stop covering it. I mean, you would think they'd be covering it for months. It's an explosive story. So it's absolutely an example of the double standards. By the way, just the fact, right? I mean, Donald Trump was bleeding out of his hands for the world to see just weeks ago. And somehow, despite covering every, misutterance from Joe Biden, who's grown up with a lifelong stutter, by the way, every step that he takes, every shoe that he wears, they don't seem to think it's a story that 77-year-old unhealthy, obese Donald Trump is bleeding out of his hands. Like, that should be a story too.
He has had so many missteps in his and the other thing is when Joe Biden's talking, he's talking about nuanced policy and often because has that stutter and because he has an active engaged mind that understands all of there's so many different tangents that he can go down on any topic that has to do with his job. So he's talking in these long paragraphs, right? And then they'll go in like, oh, there he was. He stumbled on that word, got that one wrong. But over here is Donald Trump. Um, Tennis shoes, Melania, Mercedes,
Right.
right? And they're like these little, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but he's got these like, I don't know, 4 words, phrases that he kind of pushes out, and he can't even get those out properly. He's not even getting the right words there. He's forgetting, he has his note cards and he's forgetting the name of one of his sons and leaves him out of even though he has note cards. Meanwhile, the media is in hysterics because Joe Biden used note cards for something.
Wild, which all these
Yeah.
folks will be using note cards. They use their own notes when they're asking these questions. I mean, I think what's interesting is just how embedded this double standard is in every story. And I can think of an example just from yesterday or the day before. Alexi McCammond, who is one of the opinions folks at the Washington Post, had a piece out, and it's one of those pieces where they all talk to the other opinion writers and, pat each other on the back for their brilliant political analysis. But the question was, should Joe Biden debate Donald Trump? And 3 times, I kid you not, in this story, first of all, she starts by saying, okay, so if Biden accepts Trump's challenge, will Donald Trump respond, okay, Gramps, let's do it? So it's like First of all, in this scenario,
Wow.
77-year-old Donald Trump, who is a grandfather to 10 himself, is apparently going to be calling Joe Biden Gramps or Grandpa because only one of these folks is old. Again, that's like the lens that they're operating from. Then later down in the piece, she once again says Joe Biden is old. Finally, her colleague says Trump's old too. And so she's corrected. Then a third time, she says, okay, but do you think it'll be harder for Joe Biden because he's older to
Oh
debate
my
Trump again?
God.
It's like, okay, but the same amount of time has passed for Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So they are both equally older since 2020. But this is, by the way, a short little piece. How much, a story not even about age, how much has this bias by this reporter been embedded? And you really
Ugh.
can't escape that. That's just one example.
That
Um,
and
so,
even worse because who is not going to debates right now? Donald Trump. He's the one
right.
that's refused to go to debates.
Well, and when
Why
do
are they
presidents debate before the general election?
right?
Never.
I mean,
So
but
it's all crazy.
the, but Donald Trump won't even go to these primary
Right.
right that he's been invited to. He's just sitting them all out as if he's the incumbent. He's kind of acting that way, like he's in
Totally.
office right now, and some of his people believe that he is in office right now. Sadly, I live around some of these people. But that's that whole piece that you just mentioned, that see that kind of that contempt. This is what I keep seeing over and over again. There's just this contempt. When there's contempt for Joe Biden, it's contempt for democracy. Joe Biden is he is, busting his bum to protect this country. And part of that is to make sure that it's working for working class people again. That protects our democracy. And I don't think, the economic reporter at the New York Times is even thinking about that. But
Right.
part of what, in the broader picture, when a president, luckily, we have someone with all of this experience and he understands exactly what he understood, what was needed when he came into office, and he still understands it, which is he's got to build up faith in this democracy. And the way to fight off encroaching autocracy, and the way to do that is to make people think their government is working for them. So when I see the media telling people over and over again, either to ignore what's happening, that it's not working for them, or to falsely conflate working for them with not working for them, it really does make me wonder, why are you doing that? Because that is only going to get Donald Trump elected. And they know it. They certainly know their history, probably way better than I do. But, you know, I, this, I have taken, because of Donald Trump, even when he first ran, I started listening to all of these professors, Yale professors and other people who were talking about Russia and were talking about how this disinformation works. And I just wonder, how come other people in other media outlets, like, isn't that something everybody should be expert at now? They should understand what they should be looking for. Look at the Hunter Biden thing. Look at that. Like, oh, Rudy Giuliani, really? That was your trustworthy source that somehow got this from a laptop store and he had it before he turned it over to anybody, and nobody's gonna think about that's kind of, a weird chain of custody, right? Not that's not something we would use normally in evidence.
Right. Well, and I think what's scary to me too, and I know we talked a little bit about sort of engaging online, but I do think that these reporters, and I've had a couple of them reach out to me sometimes over things they thought were unfair. I didn't agree. But I do agree that some people take it too far, and certainly, threatening reporters, harassing them. I did have a disturbing example where somebody reached out and said their family had been contacted by some folks online after, sort of like 100, 200 people are focusing on a ridiculous story. It was actually the Kamala Harris Bluetooth story, if you remember that, where they were like focusing on her technology use. And a lot of people pointed out that it was kind of a racist and sexist angle on the first Black woman vice president for reasons I don't think that these journalists understood. And it certainly crosses a line, I think, when people try to share personal, private information about these folks and harass them. At the same time, I do think those are such few and far between examples happening on, the moderate or left side versus we had 4 years of an entire White House administration and really the whole MAGA movement directing violence and hate, actual violence. There were, that shooting at the Gazette, all of these things driven by MAGA and Trump. And these journalists, and I think it's so offensive, they will compare this talk that you and I just had to that type of vitriol. And it is so unproductive, disingenuous, and dangerous to engage in that, because it's one thing to say, yes, we should all have this baseline of discourse and respect, and obviously shouldn't break the law because it's certainly illegal to, direct any of that violence. But I think once you get into the game of trying to say any criticism of the press, any calling out on social media, any pushback is anti-democracy, anti-free press, whatever, that then you lose everybody because it just doesn't ring true.
And these are this defense is coming from people who ironically hide behind their need to dissent from this administration as the reason that they're constantly talking about Joe Biden's age, for example.
Right. I mean,
They
how
say,
delusional. I don't know if
yeah.
you saw that post by, I think it was like Dylan Byers in Puck, that the White House press corps has been not talking about Joe Biden's age secretly in agreement, and that her report has ripped this open, and now they feel compelled to talk about his age. It's like, what planet are you on
And you
that
know
the
what?
White
I
House
mean,
press corps hasn't covered this?
I think it's so like what you were talking about before. I just want to share this really quickly because as a media outlet under Trump, he targeted us twice for two different audits. And no one talks about that kind of stuff and how damaging that is to a small business and how much attention it takes from you. So when these people complain about um, feedback from readers about their coverage or feedback from media experts, because it isn't just the readers, media experts and former journalists are calling this out. And you're seeing that more and more and more. So there is legitimacy to it. But as you say, to hide behind saying conflating that with violence is absolutely absurd. And then to in my case, when people are saying things like that to me, I'm over here going, you didn't care when we were being literally targeted by this
Hmm.
administration. Um, because when the New York Times was covering like that several people that were critics of Donald Trump were targeted for audits, the same kind of audit that we were targeted for twice. I reached out to them to share with them, like, here's what happened, and here's the, communications that happened. And they weren't interested. So they're not interested when it happens to other media people, but yet they want to sit over here and say you can't have any feedback about our coverage. I just think that this is it's not only disingenuous in terms of how they're covering the actual candidates, but their own like taking refuge in how dare you criticize the free press. That is very dangerous. And I see that that doesn't apply to everyone from these very same people. It doesn't apply to people below them, for example. Um, and
Right. Like, well, and
right.
even just at a time when I think all these folks like to criticize Joe Biden for how he uses his platform as well. But I think one example of something super effective was when Joe Biden called out at the end of the year. He said, sort of, off the cuff, said, "Well, why don't you cover the economic data more fairly?" And it was a little news cycle for a week or two, and they're like, "How dare Joe Biden criticize the press?" And then you know what happened? They fact checked. They had to report the actual economic numbers. And all of a sudden, a month later, the narrative finally flipped. Even though all the indicators stayed the same, they were good. It was finally, oh, the economy's strong. Oh, Americans are feeling the economy's strong. And so it was a really effective move by Biden to call it out. And you know what that wasn't? That wasn't calling for violence against the press from the White House press podium. That wasn't saying that the media is the enemy of the people. And even though cable tried to cover it that way, it doesn't make it true,
That
right? Joe
is,
Biden's
yeah,
allowed to
right.
say, I don't like how you covered this one nuanced story. And he's not even saying I don't like it. He's just saying it's not true. It's not accurate, right? I
And
mean, the numbers don't lie.
the other thing is like what to me this the press over and over again they they act like a body that wants to be talked to with contempt um by an autocrat. because then they all fall into line. Like the day Trump took office, I remember that he accused one of the press, the White House press reporters of lying about I think it was the Lincoln bust being moved. And immediately that had to be walked back. And then, the whole time I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, this is really strange. This doesn't bode well because I'm seeing the press self-censor. And
Mhm.
that continued on. And it got worse and worse and worse, where people were so careful not to say anything that he might disagree with. And then to come when they know they're going to now be operating under a president who isn't going to do that to them. And then they get wild. And, one of those press conferences recently where they were hollering at
Right
President
after the
Biden.
Her report, it was disgusting.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that was the most embarrassing thing. I was completely horrified by that behavior, especially as it touched on the death of his son. I just there is there is a thing about, how come we have these morals? We don't attack the family of other politicians. Why is it okay to do to this president? Why is it okay to keep bringing up his son who died in these ways that are meant to get an emotional reaction out of him, which will then make his stutter worse. I mean, I see all of this as very, not by the press, but by Trump and by the Republicans and that report. This meant to kind of trip him up emotionally by keep focusing on his dead son. I don't think
Well,
there's a worse thing you could do to
it was
somebody.
horrible to watch.
It
Horrible.
is. It is. It was a feeding frenzy. It absolutely made me sick.
And I think though what was so interesting is it really exposes, you were talking about elitism before and how Democrats always get charged with being elitists. And it's interesting to me because I wrote a piece for Midas Touch, actually, which I think does great work, about how for years and years and years, we've been hearing about how Democrats are the party of out of touch elitists and they go to Ivy League schools and they don't know what regular Americans want. This cycle, who'd you have? You had Ron DeSantis, you had RFK Jr., you had Vivek Ramaswamy. The list goes on. All went to Harvard, all went to Yale. Marianne Williamson even went to Pomona College, super elite place, right? Dean Phillips went to Brown. All these hoity-toity folks. You know who didn't do that? Joe Biden, who went to two public schools and has achieved more than any of those other folks. And yet he is the most relatable, in touch president I think we've had in that sense. And suddenly the media is no longer interested in that narrative or angle. Now, what was the flip of it is that it's actually the media who is all these Ivy League educated folks. And a report just came out, very interesting, encourage people to check it out. And I have the numbers in front of me. Currently, top US undergraduate colleges at the New York Times. 26 employees went to Yale University, 21 Columbia University, 20 Harvard University, 14 Northwestern, 13 Berkeley, and then 10 for Brown, Cornell, and Princeton. And then you wonder, why are these outlets obsessed with the Ivy League culture wars? Why are they
Mm.
obsessed with college campus protests? Why are they obsessed with Claudine Gay and all these stories? Who in America gave a crap about the plagiarism story? Not really that many people,
Mm.
probably. But all
Mm.
these folks, it's their networks, it's their peers, and it's that's how they see the world. And so there's a huge disconnect in that sense.
I could not agree more. And I think that goes to like what I was saying when we started this conversation about how they're bringing this sense of elitism into their coverage because, that is not most people's experience. And I went to boarding school with very wealthy people. Mitt Romney went to the same boarding school. And in that world, I really got to know that it is a different world. These people are operating with a different they don't have the kind of worries that people that don't live in that kind of privilege have. And if you can't cover the news for the majority of people, if you have no experience, trying to make it in this world without all of that privilege, it's a different story. And I'm not saying that that means those people can't have that job, but there need to be people there who don't have that experience to balance it out at the very least.
Absolutely.
So This has been so enlightening, and I am so grateful to you for giving me this time today, and that we went over the time that I
I saw
that
that, but
I
I got
asked
lost in
you.
the
Yeah,
conversation.
I did too. I did too so much, and I just think that you really enlightened me about so many things in this conversation and brought to light things that I hadn't considered. So I am so grateful that you joined me today, and I hope that we make it through this election
Yes.
and get to the other side with our democracy intact. And I say this on every podcast, I think, but I do have faith in the American people. I don't have faith in a lot of these institutions, and the media is one of them. So I keep asking people, like, you guys on the ground, talk to your friends and family and inform people, because that's going to change. The media is not going to do their job. So we have to do it. Everyone on the ground has to do it, the job, and make sure everybody knows what's at stake in this upcoming election.
100%. And my last little plug, because you said that so perfectly, people keep saying that it's like butthurt emails all over again, this cycle of coverage.
Yeah.
Here's my point to you though. It is not, because butthurt emails was something that we started talking about in 2017 when we looked back into hindsight and finally got people to realize the New York Times and all these institutions failed and they obsessed about this absurd story. We are now in this election right now, having lived through 2016, having lived through but her emails. So let's not get to 2025 and do but his age or, any nonsense but Hunter Biden. Let's call out the bad coverage in real time to make sure we win. And that is all.
No, very well. That is such a good point. And I do think, and not just, and we could talk forever probably, but I do think that Democrats um, and moderates in general, and there's plenty of Republicans who have joined, the center moderate trying to fight for our democracy. These folks, the more moderate you are, the less inclined you are to engage in, like, you know, calling to kind of
Mm-hmm.
be confrontational, right? But
Yep.
we've got to be a little bit more assertive about what is going on and calling this out now, and act like, somebody's taking your democracy away from you, because they are. Every lie that gets passed in like this in the media is doing harm. So absolutely, I agree. Call it out now. So, uh, well, thank you so much for joining me today. And this has been Sarah Jones on the Politicus Pod for Politicus USA's The Daily. And if you are tired of billionaires controlling the news you see, as we just discussed, and you want to support independent news that puts the people first, please do subscribe to our Substack. Thank you.